So, good evening. Welcome to the second lecture in the IBC and Commerce Bank Keynote Speaker Series for 2024 and 2025. I'm George Clark. I'm the Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade in TAMIU's A.R. Sanchez School of Business. Our center, together with IBC Bank and Commerce Bank, brings speakers to talk about topics in the areas of international trade, economics, finance, demography, immigration, democracy, and other issues related to the border. So that's what this talk does. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to thank our sponsors for supporting the event, IBC Bank and Commerce Bank. With their support, we've been able to bring many thought-provoking speakers over the years to TAMIU and to Laredo. So thank you very much. I also want to do a little bit of housekeeping on behalf of the students. At the end of Dr. Mumme's presentation, there'll be a question and answer session. We will take questions from those in the audience here today. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and one of our student assistants will bring you a microphone. It's important you wait for the microphone because we need, for the online people to hear you, you need to be talking into a microphone. So just talking very loudly doesn't allow them to hear you. You need to be talking into the microphone. If you prefer, so if you're in the audience, you can submit your questions via Sligo using the QR code on the front of the program. So if you don't want to ask your question out loud, you can submit it through Sligo. If you're attending virtually, you can also ask questions using the Q&A feature in Teams, and we'll try to address as many questions as our allotted time allows. For students attending in person and on behalf of one of your classes, you should have had your student ID scanned at the door. In addition, you are provided with a QR code which takes you to an online form where you submit your class information. Finally, you'll scan your ID when departing once the lecture has ended. For students attending online, your class information should have been submitted during the registration process. So with the housekeeping over, I want to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Stephen P. Mumme. Dr. Mumme is Emeritus Professor of Political Science at Colorado State University, where he served from 1983 to 2024, teaching comparative environmental politics and policy, with an emphasis on U.S.-Mexican water and environmental relations. Since 2018, he's been a non-resident scholar with the U.S.-Mexico Center at the James Baker Institute for Policy Studies at Rice University. In 2021, he was honored with the Association for Borderland Studies Lifetime Achievement Award. He is the author of Border Water, The Politics of U.S.-Mexico Transborder Water Management, 1945 to 2015. This book is available by the TAMIU bookstore here tonight. So if you want to get a copy of the book after hearing the talk, you will be able to. He's also written several other books and has papers in dozens of high-quality academic journals and edited volumes. He's also authored opinion pieces that have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Arizona Daily Star. Finally, he's been quoted in a range of publications, including the Wall Street Journal. So let's welcome Dr. Mumme to TAMIU and to Laredo.
I really want to express my appreciation to the IBC Bank, the Commerce Bank, and certainly to the College of Business for supporting my estancia aquí en Laredo, and particularly for the opportunity to actually talk about one of my favorite subjects. And it's not always that I get that opportunity, so I hope I'm not going to bore you to death with some of the little triviata that often come with talking about this topic. I've titled the presentation today as the U.S.-Mexican 1944 Water Treaty as a constitutional document. Now, that's not usually how the treaty is discussed. So I want to basically make a case that is, I don't think it's terribly controversial, but it's certainly one that some people who are knowledgeable about the treaty might take a little contest with. And I want to say that up front, etc. It's a good treaty, international treaty, is always a little bit controversial. I'm going to scroll down. Title. So this is the first page of something called the Utilization of Waters of the Colorado and Tijuana Rivers and of the Rio Grande, the treaty signed between the United States and Mexico in 1944. And this is a document that is, let me just say, is extraordinarily important for the city of Laredo and every community along the U.S.-Mexican border. I like this picture. There are not very many pictures at all that exist in the National Archives, and I've been through it, of the signing of the treaty. And I don't know all of the, still haven't nailed down all of the individuals in this photograph, but the person right at the head of the table there is Secretary of State Cordell Hull during the Roosevelt administration. And the person sort of sitting to his right, to your left, with the kind of the large frame, is Lawrence Lawson, who's one of the legendary commissioners for the international, U.S. section of the International Boundary and Water Commission, who headed the International Boundary Commission before it became the International Boundary and Water Commission. Basically saw one of the diplomats that saw the process through creating the treaty. And then there's some of the Mexican dignitaries are there too. Rafael Fernandez Megreger is the Mexican commissioner, and F. Castillo Najera is the head of Relaciones, I think also signed it at the time. So the treaty was signed in November 1944, and it was reviewed by the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it was reviewed by the Mexican Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the Mexican Congress, ratified in the U.S. In 1945 in April. This was right after, not too long after President Roosevelt had passed away and Truman had become president. Actually, Truman oversaw the signing, etc. It was ratified by a vote of 76 to 10, which is a pretty good number for the U.S. Senate with treaty ratifications. So it had strong support. And it was unanimously ratified by the Mexican Senate in October and went into effect about a year after it was signed in 1945. It is a very significant document. It is among the most important bilateral treaties that we have. I would put it third, behind the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, behind the Mesilla Treaty of 1853, and then the 1944 Water Treaty. It is that important, etc. It was widely regarded as a triumph of a diplomatic achievement for Mexico, and a triumph for the foreign ministries, and to some extent a triumph for the U.S. State Department. Now, I say that guardedly because not everybody liked this treaty at the time it was signed, and California in particular voted against it. It was thought that it really deprived them of certain opportunities, and they were not all that happy about it. Interestingly enough, it was non-controversial in Texas. Texas was absolutely for this treaty. It was just practically 100%. The treaty was thought to be perhaps arguably most beneficial to Texas. Now, I'm going to get into it, and there are issues, obviously. But one of the things I come to believe is that after more than 75 years, going on 80 years now, since the treaty was signed, that the treaty has become something that has such a unique status that it might be called quasi-constitutional. And that's where we can get into a really interesting argument with international lawyers and domestic lawyers and lawyers of various sorts. But here's how I think we should think about it. First, do treaties occasionally can they come to possess a quasi-constitutional status? And the short answer is yes, particularly if we think of constitutionality as a function of treaty consolidation. That is, of incrementally building support for an agreement, and an agreement becoming embedded in the life and practice of the contracting countries, contracting nations. A good example, and one that I think is uncontroversial, is boundary treaties. Boundary treaties define, they limit sovereignty, they contain sovereignty. And even though they're not maybe mentioned in your Constitution, they are inherently constitutional because your authority is confined by that treaty, etc. So it's maybe a sort of an esoteric kind of argument here, but territorial treaties have that unique status. That's why they're so important. That's why boundary treaties are so important, because whatever else is going on in your sovereign country, that's the limit. That's where it stops, right? So territorial treaties are inherently, I think, constitutive. Other treaties may acquire that status, but it becomes a little bit more controversial. And where you see that happening is where they come to have features that tend to override and basically subsume domestic law or municipal law. And when that happens, when domestic law is embedded in the faithful performance of a treaty, and the treaty is constitutive essentially of domestic law, treaties, of course, override domestic law. That is their nature. They are the highest law of the land. And so when that happens, then I think an agreement like the 1944 Water Treaty can become kind of quasi-constitutional, etc. And I do think that that's what it has evolved into. I don't think, by the way, that it had achieved that status until about the mid-1970s. We can talk about that perhaps if you're interested. So what are some criteria that might apply to creating a quasi-constitutional freshwater treaty status? The first is, I would argue, complexity. A treaty needs to be complex. Now, I'll get to that in a minute. I'm going to get into each one of these factors in a minute. The second is that it allocates water. It allocates water. The third is that it creates joint mechanisms for implementing the treaty, for bringing the treaty about. And the countries have committed to that. The fourth is that it provides for fact-finding and dispute settlement. That's very, very important. It has to do that. Then it should also allow for interpretation and amendment. That is, it can't just be one thing forever, right? It has to be somewhat resilient. Another factor, which I think is maybe more debatable, is that should last a long time. Should last a long time. And finally, and this maybe is the obvious point, it should have the support of the stakeholders in the treaty. And ideally, seeing that stakeholder support broaden over time. So let's talk about complexity. A lot of people who think about the treaty don't think about it in detail. And one thing I will say is that this is a very complex agreement. It is first a multi-river basin treaty. It deals, as the title says, with the Rio Grande, the Colorado River, and the Tijuana River. So it is, in some respects, 3 treaties in one. A lot of international rivers treaties only deal with one river. This one deals with 3. And by the way, the reason that that occurs that way is because Mexico insisted on it. Mexico was not going to sign a treaty on the Rio Grande or the Colorado River with the United States if it wasn't cobbled together in this common document. And so there is a kind of loose linkage, but you don't want to push that too far because, in fact, these rivers are treated separately, and that's important. They are not necessarily transitive in their effect to the other rivers. The solution on one river, et cetera. You can't generalize from the Tijuana River to the Rio Grande. Forget that. That's not happening. And that was by design. That was intentional. A multi-purpose treaty also deals with different types of problems. In this case, the 1944 Water Treaty deals with allocation, sanitation, flood control, and hydropower, to name a few. And that's expanding out, by the way. We can talk about that. But certainly those were very, very big concerns. In fact, one reason Texas was so enthusiastic about the treaty, obviously the water allocation and the water allocation provisions were important, but flood control. I've had the opportunity working in the archives, et cetera, to go over some of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers photos of what it looked like in the valley when seasonal floods occurred in some years after the turn of the century in 1900. In those couple of decades, there were times when in these photos, as far as the eye can see, these are aerial photos, as far as the eye can see, it's a lake. Just a lake on both sides of the border, etc. Flooding was a major threat to the lower Rio Grande region. And so Texas was really concerned to have protection with the crafting of the large dams on the Rio Grande. A multi-purpose treaty anticipates future development. That is, it allows for that. And finally, one interesting feature that is often overlooked about the 1944 Water Treaty is that it's tightly linked to the boundary treaties. So we have a number of boundary treaties, starting with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and completing with the 1970 Boundary Treaty. And those are going to be administered by the same agency, with the same authorities. And that means that inevitably you have some connectivity between considerations of boundary considerations of how you manage water on the river. And that's still very relevant today. It's still very relevant today. But one thing I like about complexity is that, especially as treaties evolve over time, if they're complex, it becomes very difficult to change them. What does that mean? That means that if you can't change the treaty, at least directly in its wording, in its actual text, it means that the governments have to work with it. They have to work with it. They have to be somewhat resilient themselves. They have to learn how to live with it and make it work. And so it's stabilizing. A lot of treaties around the world do not have that characteristic. So the 1944 Water Treaty allocates water. That's what it's most famous for. Mexico gets 1.5 million acre-feet of water on the Colorado River. That's the number one water right on the Colorado River. Overrides anything in the basin states. It's important to understand that. It's the number one water right on the Colorado River. The U.S. is entitled to 350,000 acre-feet annually over a 5-year cycle. That's 1.75 million acre-feet over a 5-year cycle. Here in Texas from Mexico. And that's the #1 water right on the Rio Grande. Okay, it is, etc. From a legal point of view, right? From a water lawyer's point of view, that's it. And I'm sure Carlos Rubenstein thinks that. He's one of the former Rio Grande water master that has written a lot about the treaty and Texas's situation with the river and the like. It's important. The thing about allocation that's so important for international water treaties is that it immediately builds stakeholdership in the form of property rights. And when you have property rights, then people are really truly invested in the treaty, right? Then it becomes sort of personal. It's important. And you have a stake in it. Now, you might not like it at the beginning, but if it endures, then you're working with it, you're learning about it, you're staying with it, you're trying to solve problems. And so that's other types of treaties that deal with just one other function, not allocating water, aren't quite as, I think, as invested. The public isn't quite as invested as treaties that allocate water. The 1944 Water Treaty has an implementing institution, and that institution is known as the International Boundary and Water Commission, composed of 2 sections. IBWC, as it's fondly known, is really a particular type of an implementing institution, or a joint mechanism, as it's often discussed in the international legal literature. And it's what I call a type B institution. It has linked sections with limited watershed scope. There are some commissions today, treaties that create commissions that are more broad gauge, that deal with the whole basin. The IBWC wasn't given that kind of authority by the 1944 Water Treaty, etc. Some of that is beginning to evolve over time, and we're seeing that on the Rio Grande today. But it didn't really start out that way. It's more of a limited, delimited scope kind of treaty. That sort of national individual section stakeholdership and management of the treaty does have the value of creating a sovereign interest. So you're not transferring power to an international commission. The participating countries, the contracting countries, are going to maintain their final authority over what happens with the treaty. And that's the situation that we're in with the 1944 Water Treaty, etc. Now, I'm very fond of the IBWC. I've studied the IBWC probably more than any living academic by now. And I've seen it grow and develop and deal with a variety of different problems, sometimes well, sometimes less so. Neither here nor there. But the one thing to appreciate about the IBWC is it builds on the old International Boundary Commission. So we actually have, if we include the International Boundary Commission, was created in 1889, we actually have over a century of experience working with our boundary and water problems. And the IBC came to have a water function in the 1920s when international water commissions that were short-lived were unable to actually accomplish what they were set out to do. And there was kind of a default to the International Boundary Commission, which, by the way, is the first international body that we have between Mexico and the United States. It's the original one. There was no U.S.-Mexico anything before before IBC. So that's the logo. You've probably seen that around town or in some documents. The IBWC logo. The treaty provides for dispute settlement, and this is really important because there have been quite a few disagreements and issues and concerns related to the treaty over the years, and on both rivers, including even the Tijuana, and even today. But I think the people who study international rivers agreements and treaties, and et cetera, are almost uniform in saying that fact-finding is a key to dispute settlement. And joint fact-finding is critical. Specifying procedures that are about settling disputes is fundamental to a good treaty because there will be disputes. There will be difference of interpretation. The 1944 treaty does have those kinds of mechanisms. Now, the one thing I will say is that joint fact-finding is not explicitly set out in the treaty. That has evolved, that each section has the right to find facts. And under the treaty, the Mexican section has the right to cross the border in its diplomatic capacity and ask questions and to gather facts. The United States can do the very same thing, etc., because they are enabled in that way in their diplomatic capacity, and that's a joint fact-finding activity. But what has evolved over the years is there's more and more joint fact-finding. And so even though that's not specified in the treaty, there's more and more joint fact-finding, and that's a good thing, because that means that at least we're dealing with apples and apples, rather than apples and oranges, but typically those disagreements on facts are fundamental to all controversies over natural resources, water, etc. And so that's very important and central. You've all probably, or some of you at least, have heard reference to something called a minute. A minute. And the 1944 Water Treaty allows for interpretation and amendment. And that's done through something called the minute process, which really originally, back in 1889, referred to the actual journals of the commission when they met in common, the two sections met in common and reached some kind of understanding, and it was recorded as minutes, etc. So that practice endured, and it was folded in and continued and even strengthened in the 1944 Water Treaty from the old IBC in the first half of the 20th century. And so it provides a mechanism for interpreting and thinking about solutions and then arriving at agreements that carry the force of the treaty. And this is something I really want to emphasize. In fact, quite a few lawyers who talk about the U.S.-Mexican border, et cetera, referring to the International Boundary and Water Commission and the minutes, will say that they are they allow for amendments to the treaty. That doesn't have to be an amendment. Amendments typically occur when you have controversies and disputes or some need to evolve the thinking about the agreement. But the minutes do allow you to then interpret the meaning of the treaty. And this is one reason that oftentimes when I've talked to journalists, I've said, the treaty isn't the problem. In most cases, the treaty isn't the problem. The treaty will admit lots of changes. It actually does. The problem is the governments and getting minds together to agree on a solution. And if they do that, then chances are the language of the treaty isn't a barrier. I mean, it does set some conditions, but the treaty itself is much less of a problem than people think. Why? Because if the two governments agree, if the two sections of the International Boundary Water Commission do their joint fact-finding, come up with a solution they recommend to the governments, the State Department in Relaciones Exteriores in Mexico, agree, and the president sign off, then the presidents won't actually sign the minutes, but sometimes oftentimes just the commissioners, but they have to have the approvals, and so those minutes then go into effect, and they have the full force of the treaty behind them, etc. The disagreement I have with some of the international lawyers is I don't think it's technically correct to call them an amendment, because when we think about amendments, we think about amending our own constitution and actually changing the terms, right? The actual written language, right? Well, the 1944 Water Treaty has never been altered in its written language. It's just being interpreted. It's being applied. And so it's not an amendment in the way that we commonly think about amendments. But it does have that effect. It does have that effect in most cases, etc. And the minutes context, we now have 331 minutes. 1 minute was signed just on Friday. As some of you might have seen in the newspaper. I was immediately interested in what they had to say. It's very important and it's constructive, at least somewhat. So it's just one of those things where you see minutes dealing with controversial issues. You see minutes that are totally uncontroversial, just they're very, very practical. Things like allowing Tijuana to use the conduit pipe that ships Colorado water occasionally through California to Tijuana. Mostly when Tijuana makes that request, it's using its own water, but it's getting it a slightly different way. and it's kind of uncontroversial. It's just an engineering decision, right? It's a practicality. Things like the decals on the IBWC vehicles, right? That's a practicality. And it gets a minute too. So whether we're solving the problem of water scarcity on the Colorado River, or we're talking about decals on the IBWC vehicles, you know, it's all in the minute form. Longevity. Longevity is a really interesting issue with regard to treaties. But I've studied a lot of treaties and water treaties. I taught a course for years at Colorado State University called The Politics of Transboundary Rivers, and had a chance to review dozens and dozens and dozens of treaties. One thing that's, I think, really interesting, and this is kind of subjective for sure, is that treaties that have this kind of quasi-constitutional status need to last. You don't really can have as much confidence in the ability of treaties to do the work if you don't have a history, and you don't have that knowledge of the past. You haven't had the opportunity to kind of see how disputes are being dealt with, the kinds of things that can be done to really envision how well the wheels are grinding and with respect to the treaty. But once treaties have lasted for years, there's a number of things that are clearly present. In the case of the U.S. and Mexico, it means that many different administrations have supported that agreement from different points of view. Republicans and Democrats, you know, priistas and morenistas, right? And Mexico. That embeds the stakeholdership in the agreement. It means that these things are considered somewhat constituted of how things are done. And you craft a lot of your domestic water uses and your practices around what's in the treaty. And that becomes part of what they call the law of the river and how that is thought about. So there's no magic number, I don't think, here. But 50 years seems to be a decent interval. And what I'm saying to you is that we have a lot of new water treaties around the world. By the way, the world's rivers are under treaty. There are a lot of potential disputes in the management of world rivers today because countries don't have treaties, they don't have agreements. But new agreements are coming online from time to time, and we just have to find out how good they are, whether the countries are going to stay with them, what their value is, their lasting value is. And so I recommend 50 years is a good round number. I think that that people will disagree, but the fact that the 1944 Water Treaty has lasted so long now really gives it an authority and a value to the countries that a lot of newer treaties simply do not have. And then there's stakeholder support, and I've talked about this already, et cetera. Within the immediate service zone, for example, the Rio Grande River itself, et cetera, there are close to 11 million people, et cetera. If we added the populations of the states, which I think would be fair, that's many more, right? Because the economies here along the Rio Grande have real significance to the state of Texas. People in Houston don't know it maybe, but are depending on this treaty, et cetera. And I think that's pretty well understood in Austin. Texas Water Development Board, et cetera, probably have that well in mind. But it kind of gets lost because, and I think this is true of all of our border states. The further north you go, the further away you are from the border, and some from the rivers, and et cetera. And people don't realize, just what all the significance may be for them and how it's relevant. But I mentioned here that when we look at the Colorado River, for example, we see the strength of stakeholdership really being a key factor in the ability of the U.S. and Mexico to reach an agreement in 2010 and in 2012 and 2017, and we're looking at a new agreement coming up in 2026. Just as a nerdy little point of which you can accept or reject. For fun, a few years ago, I decided to do a systematic study of the 650 transboundary freshwater water treaties, et cetera, using this criteria that I just gave you, et cetera. What's really interesting is that both of the water treaties for the U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Mexico qualify as quasi-constitutional, but only about 6 others meet that criteria. So we're talking about a very small set of agreements that are so unique, that have that importance, that have endured in a really constructive way for a very, very long period of time. And so it's nothing to be taken for granted, for sure. This involved the hard work of many, many people over the years, from one end of the border to the other, and embedded in this really remarkable document that we enjoy today. Now, I'm going to wrap up just with recognizing the treaty is not perfect. It has some exclusions, et cetera. We've seen, for example, the problem of drought and the ability to cope with drought on all of our treaty rivers. That's an issue, certainly on the Rio Grande and the Colorado, and it's expressing itself in other places as well, and some of the other rivers. And by the way, one of the things to appreciate is that because the treaty is what it is, and I talked about that 50 years and the evolving and all of that, the treaty has come to apply to just about every stream that crosses the border, even as a dry stream like the Mumme is on the New Mexico border. And it has It has evolved in that respect in terms of its applications. But water rationing, managing transboundary groundwater. Many years ago, I predicted that U.S. and Mexico would never sign a comprehensive groundwater treaty. I wrote a dissertation to that effect. We don't have a transboundary groundwater treaty. That's too bad. That's too bad because we need something like that. And so lately, I've been doing a fair amount of writing with colleagues in the transboundary water business at the University of Arizona and Texas A&M. Looking at the prospects for a groundwater agreement, et cetera, and thinking about, because we really do need to do something with respect to groundwater. So it's such an important resource for the border. Sustaining El Paso depends heavily on groundwater. I could just name other cities. So the groundwater was not included in the treaty, but it actually is in the treaty now because of the solution to the Colorado River salinity crisis in 1973. And Mexico insisted that agreement includes some reference to groundwater. Interestingly enough, it was Mexico pushing for a groundwater agreement originally, evolving out of the salinity dispute, lasted 10 years, about 1961 to 1973. The idea that that the treaty speaks to groundwater through the minute process is established now. But then what do you do with that? Where do you go with that? That's the question. There are real problems in sanitation. Sanitation has become one of the biggest and most controversial problems that we have with the treaty today, along the U.S.-Mexican border, particularly in, you might have seen in San Diego and Tijuana. The Tijuana River is just a chronic problem, spilling sewage and contaminating beaches. And if you're the mayor of Imperial Beach in California, you're mad as hell about that. So managing sanitation sewage is an ongoing challenge, et cetera. Provision for the ecological uses of water is something that was highly controversial for many, many years, et cetera. And it gets to property rights, and it gets to who pays for the ecological values that we treasure, et cetera. This really came to the fore in the whole debate over the Colorado River recently, and the agreements that were struck in 2012, Amendment 319, and Amendment 323, both provide for a small bit of ecological water on the Colorado River. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of people in the private sector have actually paid for that, and so it's kind of interesting. But it tells me that you can get really creative with this treaty. You can use all of your stakeholders to kind of figure out solutions. And again, the treaty isn't the problem. It's human beings on both sides of the border that need to get their heads together and say, we've got a problem, and now let's see if we can solve it in some way, if there's some rational way of going about it. So advising the IBWC, it's been a big debate. There have been lots of different suggestions that the IBWC needs more of a binational, advisory body, this, that, and the other. Whether that will come about, I don't know. But it's just one of the things that's out there. And the IBWC can hire consultants, and it can go to anybody and ask for their opinion, et cetera. And it does that with some frequency. But having said that, there are quite a few people who have argued over the years that the IBWC needs to build out a little bit of its advisory function and be able to routinely take advantage of certain perspectives that are relevant to the management of the rivers and sanitation issues and things like that, et cetera. And then more recently, you probably may have seen the fact that there's a lot of discussion of new water sources. How are we going augment our water resources along the U.S.-Mexican border at a time of drought and water scarcity, and of course rising demand for water. So where do we go? And I think that a lot of the creative problem solving related to the treaty is going to come in that dimension. So there's just a lot to be done in terms of adding to, improving, extending, applying the treaty, but it's a good treaty, and it served the countries well, and I'm very fond of it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Am I within? I hope I'm not pushing the time limit.
So if there are any questions from the audience, just raise your hand and they will bring, our students will bring microphones to you. It may take a little time to get to you, but still we need microphones up here. And here and here. And we have some questions online, but we'll do the questions in person.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things, as far as our area, we look at Falcon Lake, we look at Amistad. Falcon Lake is about 14% full. Amistad's about 26% full.
Yeah.
You look back 40 years, these lakes were probably 80, 75% full. A lot of that could probably due to the droughts, but also how about what my understanding is 2/3 of all the water source comes from Mexico.
Right.
And there's been a lot of the damming in Mexico. So what about the water debt? So, I mean, to me, that's been a failure by the International Water Boundary Commission.
Yeah, I don't personally blame the commission for dealing with a really, really thorny problem. But it is something that comes up, and I definitely take your question. This gets to the uniqueness in the treaty and how the treaty treated the rivers differently. So as I mentioned on Article 4 of the 1944 treaty, water treaty, basically allocates to Texas 1.75 million acre feet over a 5-year cycle. What it doesn't specify is how that water should be delivered during the 5-year cycle. Right. And what's more, to make matters even more, when I tried to explain this to my students, they were always scratching their heads. To make it even more complicated, if Mexico is arrears at the end of the first 5-year cycle, or one 5-year cycle, it does have the authority to ask for a rollover and with the provision that it pays off its water debt and then also the obligation in that second cycle. But then it gets further complicated by the fact that the treaty says that if Mother Nature should agree and be very generous, and the storage capacity assigned to each country and each of the two mainstream dams, Falcon and Amistad, is filled to capacity, all debts are erased, all existing debts are erased, and a new cycle is begun. You start over. So the problems that we've seen have evolved since the mid-1990s, et cetera, when some of the assumptions, I think, behind the treaty drafters, that there would be enough water, seemed to be called into question. Now, a lot of things were going on. Mother Nature wasn't being very generous, et cetera, but Mexico was building out some of its irrigation districts in the headwaters of the Rio Conchas, et cetera, and so forth. So it's a complex problem associated with hydrological scarcity in terms of the precipitation, but also in terms of the types of uses and the efficiencies of uses that people are putting that water to in Mexico, and to some extent here in the U.S. as well, in the Texas border. This is the problem with the treaties. It creates a certain kind of flexibility that was originally meant to really create resilience and build resilience into compliance with the treaty. This is one reason Mexico really thought it was a good deal. Mexico didn't want to commit absolutely to the same thing that the U.S. committed to on the Colorado River. Didn't. So it gets a slightly different type of an agreement, right? It gets that kind of flexibility. But my own view, and this is absolutely a debatable, I think, perspective, is that this issue of reliability of flows has now become more transcendent. And that wasn't the case throughout most of the life of the treaty. It certainly didn't really come into focus until really the late 1990s, early 2000s, when Mexico had to ask for its first rollover in 1997, and then it rolled over to 2003. It had problems meeting that second cycle, and it was actually behind on the second cycle. And then in 2005, the dams are filled. Mother Nature complies. You get a hurricane, bam, all debts are canceled. And so you start over. So something similar happened in 2010, et cetera, when Mexico was running a little bit behind, but then you get another influx of water. But since then, Mother Nature hasn't been so kind. That's the problem that we have. And that puts a focus then on how people are using water. When Mother Nature isn't very kind or generous, then you have to look at how we're using water on both sides of the border, et cetera. And it's very controversial. We just saw this new agreement. This new agreement makes some very modest headway. And right now, as we speak, Mexico is in compliance with the treaty under the terms of Article 4. It's very important to understand that. Now, Mexico hasn't asked for a rollover. That'll come due in October of 2025. If it does, it's still within the treaty scope, because that has happened before, and we're going into a second cycle, right? Which is one reason that the new agreement says we have to have a better deal by December 2029. That reflects the terms of the treaty, et cetera. That's not satisfying to people who are losing their livelihoods in the valley. Categorically true. I mean, I fully understand that. People who have made their livelihoods from the river deserve better, for sure. And it's water gets human scale really fast. I think is the lesson there. But I think both countries are going to have to put their heads together and focus more on less on the actual fixed amounts that were promised in the treaty, and without changing the treaty, using the minute process, and focusing more on the reliability of flows. Because farmers have to plan. Municipal water services have to plan. You have to have a planning horizon. And when you have this tremendous variability, which the treaty allowed for, that's not very, very, very attractive to water managers, whether they're in ag or whether they're in the urban zone. So I'm really of the view that that's what has to happen. You see a little bit of that happening in this recent agreement. For example, Mexico made actually a significant treaty concession, saying, well, maybe we can use our lower rivers that are fully allocated to Mexico. Mexico has total ownership rights of the Rio San Juan, the Rio Alamo, et cetera. But now we could talk about maybe transferring water to meet our treaty obligations from those rivers to the valley. And that's not going to help people up here. That helps people. Gravity, water flows downhill. So there's that issue. But that's a concession. It's a hard-won concession. It's one that Mexico didn't have to make, technically, but it has. And I think one of the things I see happening with the management of the treaty, and this is also doesn't offer immediate solutions to the very serious problems we have, but we're moving in that direction. We're making progress moving in that direction. I think we'll get there. etc. Because one of the things that's happening, remember I mentioned joint fact-finding? There's an enormity of joint fact-finding now happening in the Rio Grande Basin. Mexico has made significant concessions on that. Conagua is being surveilled by the U.S. to a degree that it never was before. Yeah. That is, and part of this, interestingly enough, comes from the experience that we had on the Colorado River. Mexico didn't have to make any concessions to the U.S. on the Colorado River. The U.S. basins, 7 basin states were desperate. Because water levels at Lake Mead, which delivers water to the lower Colorado River, were so badly depleted, right? Mexico experienced an earthquake, had some damage, significant damage to its irrigation infrastructure, needed to store water behind U.S. dams and Lake Mead in particular. And all of a sudden that broke the ice. But one of the things that Mexico wanted to do, as it talked about taking a shortage, and by the way, Mexico does take a shortage. It doesn't have to under the treaty. If it wanted to be strict about the treaty, it could say, we're the #1 water right, we get our 1.5 million acre feet every year, regardless of whatever's happened to all of you folks in Colorado or Arizona, etc. But Mexico did make a concession. It's a modest concession, but it's an important one. It helped lead to agreement, etc. And it suggests to me that this is kind of what's the dynamic that's going on today. What's happening is we're looking at the agreement. We're saying, okay, there's some practical things that we need to do. Etc. We need to make some concessions. We need to work together to make sure these flows are reliable, because that's what the basin states wanted. And Mexico wanted it too, even over its legal right. And it knew that it required the cooperation of the 7 basin states, the operational management of the dam system on the Colorado River. And what the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the basin states agreed to do is to bring Mexican engineers face to face with how operations are being done on the Colorado River, right? So Conagua never had that access. It does today, okay? And what it does, it gets to joint fact-finding. People have to know that the other country is doing its best, that the other country is really trying to work with what it has optimally to get to a satisfying result. And I think that's the key. That's really the key. So I think, again, the treaty's not really the barrier. It sets some numbers. I don't think that needs to change. But at least in times when things are more acute and difficult, I do think that the two countries should be moving in the direction of considering, doing a little of this rationing in order to ensure that there's not going to be enough water. That's the defining, condition of the moment. But to ensure that the water that we have can be used more effectively, right? Because, if you're trying to grow sugarcane down in the valley these days, you don't have the reliability of flows. And it's the reliability that's as important as the quantity at the end of the day. So, I've gone on too long. But it is my favorite topic.
So I have a question that kind of follows on from this online, and that is, you talked about some changes in terms of in terms of rationing, but given this increasing pressure, this is from Gabriel Alvarez, and given the increasing pressure on water resources in both countries, do you think there are any changes that might be needed to the treaty to ensure sustainable future for U.S.-Mexico, either in the form of amendments or minutes or...
Yeah, well, that's what I was just saying. I think that these changes, moving in the direction of reliability. Now, I say I don't think you have to change the text of the treaty to do this. But what you can do is say, for a certain, we're going to monitor things. We're going to make these adjustments for a temporary period. This is exactly what's being done on the Colorado River, by the way. It's one reason we're reviewing the shortage sharing arrangements on the Colorado River this next year. There has to be a new agreement in 2026. So at a time of water scarcity and when you're making all these adjustments and trying to figure out what your water users are doing and how to use water more efficiently and all of these things that are dynamic, right? It makes sense to have shorter term agreements that are in the spirit of the treaty, that capture the spirit of the treaty, but aren't quite so litigious, and that bring people into modes of cooperation about water. And that's what makes sense to me. And I think that's where we are. That doesn't do to be hurling insults across the international boundary. It doesn't get people anywhere, etc. Each country guards its sovereignty jealously. And Claudia Sheinbaum is going to guard her sovereignty jealously for Mexico. President Trump's going to to presumably do the same thing for the U.S. And I know that Governor Abbott is of that frame of mind in Texas. But at some point you have to find a solution to things, a solution that's going to be within the spirit and not quite the letter of the treaty, but if things get back to normal, we can go back to the letter of the treaty. That's always the default, right? But I do think that we have to do some creative thinking about how we're using water, conserving water, managing water, and enabling people to at least have a reasonable expectation that things will happen in such and such a way, because that's what we expect. That's what we expect when we turn on our bathroom tap, right? It's going to be there, etc. Same is true for water in almost every possible use, etc. So that's what I think. That's a long-winded answer to a good question.
Thank you. Once again, Texas A&M International University hit a home run with this topic of water for this. The timing of this really event is just very appropriate. So congratulations. My question is more specific to minute 331. Mm-hmm. And that's what's more relevant to us right now, right, because of the contentious issue of what this minute really means to those of us down this neck of the woods. Right. And I found it striking that as I read that minute, the title of it, Measures to Improve the Reliability and Predictability of Rio Grande Water Deliveries to Benefit the U.S. and Mexico. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you believe that's true?
I think it's a first step. Well, or it's a step, right? It's a very modest step. But in international diplomacy, you have to sort of begin the conversation that way, oftentimes. And Mexico, again, has an obligation. It knows it has an obligation. It admits it has an obligation. That's not controversial, even in Mexico. But how that's operationalized in any given year is really the issue. And Mexico has multiple problems, doesn't do as good a job with its water efficiencies, et cetera, as in the U.S., and the U.S. has its own problems in that regard. So I think what we're going to see is a little bit more of the same, unfortunately, and that will take some years for the full effects to be realized. And what I mean by that is I think we're going to see more investments in irrigation infrastructure in Mexico. We're going to see more accounting. I was mentioning to somebody earlier on today at lunchtime that one of the things that Mexico has done that I think is a significant concession by Mexico is to allow a lot of this U.S. water monitoring to occur in the Rio Grande tributary headwater systems, et cetera. Countries don't have to do that, but Mexico is not obligated to do that under its treaty. But Mexico, again, just like the U.S. brought Mexican engineers to the U.S. to understand what was going on in the Colorado River, Mexico now is increasingly inviting the U.S. to help it manage its water resources. Now, part of the problem there is the over-allocation of water rights in Mexico, and a lot of informal water users that aren't being very well regulated by CONAGUA, that tap into the official systems and take water that they're not supposed to have. There are all kinds of inefficiencies that need to be addressed, but addressing those inefficiencies takes time and effort and money. And that's where we're at, I think, right now. Hopefully, this new provision in this minute for projects. I mean, people should watch that here in Laredo, I was saying at noontime, rather closely, because there are going to be some real opportunities in that. We don't know the fine print or just what specific projects are going to be prioritized or whatever, but on both sides of the border, focused on water conservation, on water efficiency, et cetera. And so my hope is that goes forward rapidly. I think that would be very beneficial to people in the lower Rio Grande, middle lower Rio Grande region. But I think we're moving towards this idea of preserving sovereignty, yes, but engaging more in joint management efforts. Mexico is a different political system than the U.S., and we all know that. And things work differently. Some decisions don't get made as quickly, and there are capacity issues that are always confronting the Mexican government. One of the things that's sort of annoying to me is that when I follow Mexican affairs and what's going on in the water world in Mexico, there is a little bit of a sense in Mexico that the border gets too much attention in Mexico. But that's not, that's a statement, it's not a solution. And I think that Mexico has an obligation to prioritize these problems under the treaty. That much is clear, I think. So hopefully, it's progress in little steps. Hopefully, these little steps, amplify in the short to medium term, and their solutions. And I'm not talking about Mother Nature either, because I'm not sure what her mind is all about these days. But I think that we are seeing some improvements. Mexico did make some concessions, but I think it's mostly projective. It doesn't provide immediate short-term relief to the valley, which is unfortunate, etc. So I wish I could give you a better answer. I'm still digesting the agreement myself. I'm just trying to think it through in real detail. Yeah, I think we all are. Yeah.
So some more questions. One here, one here.
Thank you, and thank you for Tammy for hosting this important conversation. There was also a TCEQ IBWC presentation done for localities in our region today at the Water Museum, and the City of Laredo hosted that. And Commissioner Maria Elena Giner was there. And I think to address the question of Mexico's water debt and this idea that they sort of would be our solution, what she indicated is that if Mexico were to return all of the water immediately, it would only solve 30% of our problem. And what they are seeing, collecting data, is that the primary rivers that feed the Amistad Reservoir, the Pecos and the Devil's River, are just not seeing the flows that they were before. The region needs, according to the 2021 Water Master Plan, 1.7 million acre feet of water per year. Mexico is entitled to 350,000 acre feet a year. the Amistad receives 670,000 acre feet and Falcon about 50. So there's a 600,000 acre feet disappearance of water. It's just not there. And so I think what I found reassuring when Commissioner Hinera was talking is that Mexico is willing to be a partner in this. They recognize also that the region is just suffering from drought conditions. Climate change seems to be indicated, and the future does not look like we're going to receive that infusion from a hurricane or some other nature coming to rescue us, that we need to be looking at how we renegotiate with an eye to there just being less water in the region. And what does that mean? Yeah. You know, and according to the treaty, the allocations for municipalities, we're higher on the totem pole. Yeah. So there's a certain amount of water that's dedicated to keeping the water system alive. And then on the next in line is simply the municipalities. And then agriculture comes after that. They receive the allocation later. And so that is where there's been a dramatic decrease in allocation to the agriculture sector because the water isn't there. Yeah. And how do we manage that?
I agree entirely with Commissioner Hinera's perspective. I think the good news there is that, again, that Mexico is much more engaged with the U.S. in looking at the whole basin and how these moving parts to the water system and how that can be better managed to create, again, more reliability. The focus is on reliability here. It's going to be increasing. It's not going far enough, in my personal opinion, in imposing some of those things on the two governments, et cetera. But you know, you have to get to an agreement, and I think we are going to see a greater and continuing emphasis on this issue of reliability using multiple water sources and so on to meet the kinds of problems. But unfortunately, in that mix, there will be, I won't say, I'm not sure there are that many winners, but they're, except in the sense of everybody having a more reliable supply. But there will be some losers because the water, as you say, just isn't there, even when we do things more efficiently, et cetera. And again, a lot of these efficiency investments will take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to play out and become effective, even if they were to start doing them today. And they're not going to be doing all of that today. They have to appropriate the money and then start doing the work. But I think the good news is, and it's belated for sure, it should have happened some years ago, is that the two governments are now getting somewhat more real about the problem they're up against and the fact they need to collaborate and cooperate together. And that's what we're seeing in the Colorado, that's what we're seeing here on the Rio Grande. So I mentioned the treaties are all separate. They do their own thing, different sets of expectations, but we can learn from what's happening in one place and try and apply those lessons in another place, et cetera, without them being necessarily treaty conditions right now. But we can learn and then build in solutions that have the force of the treaty behind them. And
my real question was about the Trump administration and the effort to put a border wall along the river. We know that IBWC usually prevents construction from being riverside because of the destructiveness to the ecosystem of the river. Now with a border wall likely to be built, how does that impact this treaty, as it's going to impact the quality and with the sedimentation from all the construction, it could affect the evaporation and quantity of water in this river?
Okay, well, you really raised one of the more contentious issues going on today. Long story short, the 1970 Boundary Treaty, which is a very important document for us, also has effects on water. It's calibrated to deal with a riparian boundary. The international boundary runs in the deepest channel of the river, according to the treaties of Guadalupe Hidalgo and Mesilla. And so the river is the boundary. The deepest channel, sometimes interpreted as the widest channel, is where the boundary flows through. There are islands that from place to place and time to time, even some close to here to Laredo. And so, what the 1970 Boundary Treaty said was that the two countries had to reach mutual agreement on any infrastructure that would be built in such a manner as to deflect the course of the river under flood conditions. Not normal conditions, under flood conditions. The idea was to preserve the integrity of the boundary, to keep it, because again, it's a riparian boundary. And as I tell my students, the problem with riparian boundaries is that the boundary is always moving. Things are eroding. Dirt is moving. The positionality, sometimes in minuscule terms, is nevertheless modified. So what they tried to do in 1970 was to keep that as stable and as secure and definite as possible. But that then set limits on what kind of infrastructure could be built, and basically two have to tango. The two countries have to agree on that. One of the problems with the border wall is that some of it, at any rate, some of it was done with the mutuality, some of it was not, and that's where it really becomes controversial. And some of those issues are still outstanding. In my view, Mexico has actually been unusually tolerant of the obstructions that are now built in some places, particularly down valley in the area where traditionally flooding was so prominent on the river, where the levees are not. They stop and they continue, and there are places where they built a lot of the border wall on the levees, by the way, as you may know, because that was compliant with the treaty. Seemed to be more compliant with the treaty, although depending on who you talk to, which hydrologists and water engineers and construction people you talk to, there could be issues under this circumstance and that circumstance, et cetera. So nothing is absolutely perfect. But that's the deal. Mexico has, I think, what we see with Mexico is that it really is trying to cooperate with the United States in a lot of ways, and that's the good news. It doesn't, again, do anybody any good to be hurling accusations across the boundary at one country or the other, because people will just, Mexico doesn't have to move to the U.S. preference all the time, and the U.S. has, of course, a lot of leverage with Mexico, with trade and the economy and all of that, and Mexico wants to keep that intact and possible strengthen that relationship. I think the whole migration issue has really complicated some of this, et cetera. What's interesting about, I mentioned this in my book, that it's kind of interesting about water, though, and I think this is at least moderately true with the Boundary Treaty, is the extent to which that operates in a zone somewhat independent of all of these other big meta issues that are going on. And I hope that continues. If you start linking what's going on with water and solutions on water, what's going on with immigration, what's going on with border security, what's going on this and the other, then our problems are just going to multiply. It's going to be much more difficult to cooperate, et cetera. So if I have any advice to offer based on my reading of the history, it's that we have to work hard at cooperation. We have to really put cooperation first and not jump to conclusions. Try and work through these issues and try and understand each other across the international boundary to deal with what are really common problems. They express themselves differently on each side of the boundary, but everybody's having problems with water supply, and everybody's having problems worried about where that river is going to go if there's too much of an impediment in one place or another. And hurricanes will happen. And we don't know how and when, but that's the great uncertainty. In 2010, there were really bad flooding down here too, et cetera. And you just can't predict it. So it's in the hands of the forces that we don't control. And so we have to be able to respond to that, and we have to be able to cooperate with one another to seek solutions to those problems. And we don't want to just get into this kind of blame game all the time internationally, because that doesn't do anybody any good. We have the message I like to project to my students is we have a good system. We just need to use it as effectively as we can. And it's a remarkable system. It really is. This treaty system that we have is truly remarkable. It really has worked for us. We in North America are very privileged in a lot of ways to our ancestors and people who did a lot of hard work to put things together. Even on the Canada border with the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty and all the things that have evolved on the Great Lakes and so forth, we're just really lucky that so much thoughtful diplomacy and hard work went into crafting these agreements. I'll tell you this, that if you got rid of the 1944 Water Treaty today, you would never get a better agreement. Not politically possible. It would be a disaster. So we need to recognize its utility and its elasticity, and just try and keep talking to one another and expressing our problems, our disagreements, our concerns, but also trying to find ways that we can mutually engage in finding solutions. That's what I would say.
Thank you. I should note we only have about 7 minutes left, so I would ask the audience to try to keep their questions as concise as possible, so that we can get to a couple more questions. I know we had a couple of people with their hands up here. We had.
Thank you. Could you talk about some of the complexities or nuances related to the transboundary groundwater agreements that we don't have, or pacts or treaties? Yeah. And do you foresee that ever coming to the table, a treaty related to groundwater?
I'm glad you asked. I've been written several articles recently with colleagues, some in the Associated with Borderland Studies and at the University of Arizona and Texas A&M, et cetera, some people that I work with occasionally. And one of the things we are arguing for is a new framework agreement on groundwater. As an agreement to agree. The reason I thought that we would never have a groundwater treaty is that the politics are so particular to the individual states and places, et cetera. And of course that, coupled to the uncertainty about aquifers, et cetera, creates a high incentive to just hope that you're going to have enough water going forward. And that creates the proverbial race to the bottom with aquifers. So the incentive structure works against conservation in groundwater management, et cetera. Unfortunately, I think that's true. But what I think now a lot of people recognize in the water community is that we can reach agreements to agree that then particularize the problems along. So you get local communities across the border deciding that they need that they're stakeholders in this aquifer, and they need to figure out a way not only to know better what they're using and how they're depleting the aquifer, but how to manage it. And one of the big problems here is water quality. A lot of these aquifers are being contaminated, particularly in and around urban areas, etc. Nogales had a big problem with trichloroethylene contamination, for example. That's not good. They depend on groundwater as well. They have the Rio Santa Cruz is basically mined for its groundwater in Mexico and in the U.S. And so, and it does flow occasionally, but mainly these days to the as wastewater is discharged from the International Sewage Treatment Plant about 12 miles south of Nogales, Arizona. So, it's we need to have communities coming together and saying we want to be stewards of this resource, and then you don't want a treaty language that is supposed to be sort of one size fit all, applying to what local communities can do themselves. And you know, and they may need a little help from the federal governments. They may need a little help through the commission to monitor and help implement any agreements that would be reached. But right now, I think the thinking is if we can get to a framework agreement, just a kind of an agreement to agree, then we can begin the harder work of getting localities to do a better job of figuring out how they want to manage this international resource. Then we can get a series of minutes that are very specific to particular places, where the IBWC is kind of the oversight agency working with the local people to kind of figure out how to manage that effectively according to commitments that are made. So that's what's going on in groundwater.
I think we can do one more question if anyone has a question. I do have some online questions if no one has anything. So I'll give you my final online question. This was from early on, so I want to give the person the opportunity to it. With the upcoming changes of administration, what changes in international water rights do you see between the U.S. and Mexico, and what relationship changes can be foreseen?
So that's really asking me to read the crystal ball in a way that's quite hazardous. But what I would say is, for example, let's take the IBWC. So when an administration changes, often it will want to replace the commissioner. And that's just that has happened over the years. Not always. There in an earlier era in the IBWC, there was a tendency to keep people on. I don't like myself politicizing the commission that much. I'd like to see more continuity in the administration. But whoever is there, they still have the same problem of trying to deal with the issues and work within the context and scope of the treaty. So the changes aren't, hugely dramatic, and et cetera. So now, there are other water managers. I don't know who Scheinbaum is appointed to be head of CONAGUA. I'm not quite sure what's coming up in the Trump administration with the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers. That'd be an interesting thing for Americans to pay attention to, especially down here on the border where we depend on our water management to a great deal. So we just don't know. And that's one of the reasons that I say that I hope that water doesn't get tied up with these other issues. Because if water is dealt with on its own terms, diplomatically, then I think we can find ways to cooperate and move forward. It gets all bollocksed up with a lot of other ancillary debates and passionate views about this or that. That's just not helpful. And that's my view, etc. And I don't think either country is in a position of being able to really strong-arm the other about a lot of these very practical issues that they face in common. And so that's kind of what I would say.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dr. Stephen Mumme for an excellent talk, so thank you. And as a token of our appreciation, we're giving you the world. It's a globe.
Wow.
Before everyone
Thank you.
leaves, I want to thank everyone who made this event possible. I'd like to thank IBC Bank again and Commerce Bank for their generous support of this lecture series. I'd also like to thank Amy Palacios, the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Western Hemispheric Trade, who manages this event and makes sure everything goes smoothly without a hitch. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff in the School of Business, OIT, and Event Services. And I'd especially like to thank all the students who came to help with the microphones and crowd management. So thank you for that, from the students, from the Deans of Student Advisory Council. So, and thank you everyone for coming, both online and in person.